Family, we are so excited for you to join us today with Wellness Wednesday. And as you can see, we're a few members short today. You have just me and Christine, but I think it's going to be an exciting day. It'll be an adventure for us. Um, Miss Pamela is away celebrating the graduation of her grandson, I do believe, and Miss Beth is out of town, so they trusted us with the reins, and here we are wrapping up our mental health month. Um, so just to get kicked off, Christine, if you want to introduce yourself, and I'll introduce myself, and we'll get started.
Sounds great. I'm Christine Oswald. I'm the owner of Real Conversations, Christian life coaching and consulting, through which I provide virtual and long distance life coaching to worn out, weary, and worried women who are reconnecting with their person, their purpose, and their passion in the Lord. I am an MFTIT in the state of Wisconsin. I hold a master's degree in spiritual formation and counseling, and with specializations in, my master's degree is in marriage and family therapy with concentrations in spiritual formation and counseling. As y'all can, it's been a morning. and
Understand.
And Christian sex therapy. And we're so glad you're here. And so glad the Lord's here too.
Right. I'm Jessica Banner. I have a master's degree in rehabilitation counseling, which allowed me to study in professional counseling, but also in vocational and disability. I spent 10 years working in the mental health field, doing day treatment programming for adults and adolescents with substance abuse and psychiatric need, until I transitioned about 6 years ago into the private sector doing professional pastoral care with a strong emphasis in trauma recovery. Helped build a counseling department there, and I'm currently writing a book. Really working on it. Got a coach and everything. um, and actually in some new business development options right now. So excited to be here today. And as we jump in, I just want to recap a little bit. This month is Mental Health Awareness Month, the month of May, and we have been talking about mental health. The first week we did some case studies in scripture. We weren't doing hermeneutics and things like that. We were really just taking a set of skills and applying them to the story that was in front of us. And we just explored what that looked like in scripture. And in our second week, we talked about stigma. And we talked about different kinds of stigma, which we'll probably touch base a little bit about today again. And last week we talked about Jehovah Rapha and his role in our health and how we partner with him in our mental health. And as you think about the last 3 weeks, Christine, what has really stood out to you?
I think something that's come up several times is the church's history around mental health. There's kind of a special stigma, I think, sometimes within it, that we are the children of the God who is the healer. So it's kind of interesting, I think, for me, just how God has so many ways of healing. And yet, there's sometimes we have these little categories of what is and isn't. Um, and how wonderful it is that the Lord has given us the Bible through which we can see ourselves, we can learn about others. I sometimes say a lot of modern psychology is does a lot of research just to kind of confirm what the Bible's already said for thousands of years. And so I think that some of the things that stood out to me are just that we serve a really good God who cares about us. And we can take his lead in terms of how he has compassion for our humanity.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I love that we have talked so much about the relationship of mental health with the church, and not even just that, God's design, like our mental health is a part of God's design. And so we cannot be separate from us. It's not unimportant. It is a part of the system he's created and who we are. And so it is important. And I completely agree. We do live in a time where I don't disagree with the statement. A lot of our research catches up to um, searching out what God said and what he did, because that's a gift he gave us, was the ability to do that. And And he gave us creative minds to create. And, there's lots of different ways that God heals. And I love the more we can entertain the conversation, the more we're able to explore that and support each other. Absolutely. So, jumping in today, Miss Pamela has put together another wonderful script for us. She is such a talented person, just hearing from the Lord and investing her time and quiet time with the Lord and her expertise. So, she says our scripture for today comes from Proverbs 12:25. It says, "Anxiety in the heart of man causes depression, but a good word makes it glad." And that's from the New King James Version. A new Atticus study has found that mental health issues are now the most common workplace injury, and burnout provoked by stress and anxiety is the main culprit. As we discussed 2 weeks ago when we were talking about stigma, many Protestant work ethic Christians are probably sneering at the study, claiming this is just a case of laziness or not relying on the Bible for guidance. So let's talk a little bit about a couple of the stigmas. What were some of those stigmas we talked about a couple weeks ago?
That was the week I was missing, and so I'm not
Oh,
entirely certain what y'all
there we
talked
go.
about.
It's been like musical hosts this month. So,
Yeah.
Sherry, were you with us that week? I think you were.
I think I was there that week.
Hi,
Yes. I
Sherry.
came in. Hi. I came in a little bit late. So the stigma, just even admitting that there is an issue,
Mm-hmm.
being willing to come forward. Even if you came forward, often dismissed, invalidated.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
else?
I missed that
Yeah.
week, but I can add one or two. I think a lot of times
Yeah.
Christians have made it a faith issue
Mm-hmm.
historically. And I think
Yes.
especially maybe in churches that lean more towards the charismatic and Pentecostal stream of this different forms of worship and where it's if you have enough faith, if you're trusting enough, I think some of the ones that go more towards the more works stream, it's just pull yourself up by the bootstraps and do the next right thing. So I think that many different denominational responses to it might all be rather dismissive, where whether it's because you're lacking faith or whether it's because you're giving too much voice to feelings and you should just be doing the next right thing. That whatever the case is, emotions have a really tricky background with the church.
Mm-hmm.
And if you brought your concerns up to your spiritual leader, your pastor, or whoever that is, they're often ill-equipped. They don't understand them themselves. They came from their own background that invalidated and didn't honor emotions, and so they just kind of pray about it. Here's some scripture verses, and not that those things are wrong. See, there's just enough truth in there to um, the person not fully connected, not as deeply connected with their own faith, can be very easily misled with that, because God put people in place. God himself works through people. If God works through people, then we can work through people, right? We need our community. It's not solely pray and scripture. We need those, absolutely. And God put people in our lives also to uplift us, encourage us, and help us through those difficulties.
And we have talked a lot about some of the downfalls in that. And I think stigmas are something we're overcoming. But I also want to give a hats off, because I do think we're in a season of the church where there is a lot of intention of pastors and leadership. And so I do want to commend that, because working in it, I work in the church inside of mental health, and talking to other people at other churches and actually helping train other churches who are wanting to get this stuff off the ground. I'm definitely starting to see the heartbeat of the church shifting, but it is important that we still engage these conversations, because there's been a lot for generations, and that's where I want to add to some of the stigma, because not all stigma is just the church either. Some of the stuff we talked about is that there's public stigma. Really, even inside of the mental health field, there were certain certain things that had stigma. I always tell people, because I do a lot of training around trauma, trauma didn't really gain legs even in the mental health field until the 80s, 90s. And so it had been around, something that's been something we've experienced for a long time, but even our own field didn't necessarily see the importance of some of that until a little bit later in the development. Now we're still a pretty young science, but relatively speaking, but so definitely public stigma. We also deal with cultural stigmas. We deal with systemic stigmas. And so we deal with stigma in a lot of different layers. We have personal stigmas, those things that our own core beliefs that we have developed about different things. And the church is one area of our life where that exists. And obviously we're here as believers having this conversation. So we're going to address that aspect of that pretty thoroughly, because that's who we are and what we're here for. So stigma can come from a lot of different things. Families have their own cultural stigma around mental health. One of the things that I really appreciate having lots of friends across the field is I love to see people advocating even inside of their own cultural dynamic. Because like I have lots of friends that advocate in Latino populations and African-American populations. And so because there are some different things that come up culturally that can become barriers to getting help. And so we're going to move forward just a little bit. For decades, there has been a debate regarding the stigma around mental illness in general, and for Christians in particular. For centuries, people have considered mental health treatment and Christianity as two separate fields with no relationship between them. So today, the type of stigma we are highlighting is the systemic way that various Christian faith communities disparage individuals, challenge. Oh, you know what? I'm reading the wrong script, y'all. I'm in the wrong week. She's like, this isn't on that paper, Jessica.
I thought maybe I didn't get the updated version.
Girl, you got to stop a girl. Say, check in. Oh, reel it back. Let's try again. I am so grateful for grace, y'all. So let's try this again. So depression and anxiety may not seem like things that an employer should concern themselves with, but the reality is that mental health can have a critical impact on a company's bottom line. According to the World Health Organization, approximately 12 billion workdays are lost each year worldwide due to depression and anxiety. This leads to a massive decrease in productivity at an estimated cost of $1 trillion. Other than revenue, why should a Christian employer be concerned about the emotional and mental wellness among employees? What are our initial thoughts?
Yeah, I think just being a good human, Christian or not, I think I just caring about each other, right? I mean, despite the money and the bottom line, I mean, workplace culture. I mean, if you want to keep it about the workplace, workplace culture, to come into an environment where it's toxic or it's depressed in its energy or anxious, that affects everyone in terms of kind of the little family pod that a company is, or the floor of a company, or the department a company is. But just, why should we be concerned? Why are we concerned about other humans, right? We don't want anyone to suffer. And so for an employer to care, to be a caring person where they want to build up their people as much as they want to build up their bottom line. I mean, that's just kind of being a good human in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think employers too, often you're working in teams where people are working, collaborating, and because they're working on projects that are bigger than one person, right? Mm-hmm. So if we want teams to work effectively, if we want to get the best out of our people, then we need to address all aspects that they bring with them. And that includes their mental health, because they bring their brain with them and all that happens when they come to work. there is an old stigma of, leave the home at home and you're here at work. Well, I'm sorry, humans don't work that way. We don't operate that way. We don't have this wall that just blocks everything else out. And if we want effectiveness, if we want efficiency, if we want our people to thrive, to want to come to work, to want to give their best, then we need to be concerned about their mental health.
Absolutely. As I was preparing for this and thinking about it, there are a couple different layers. I agree with you, Christine, about there's just our humanity, human to human. Ideally, we do care about each other and we do want to make space because, we talk a lot about just giving each other grace, which we know that that's a concept, especially in the Christian realm of things. Like that is something we've been extended and therefore we want to extend it to others, ideally. But there is just the intrinsic value. And I recognize that not everyone harbors that belief outside of a faith community, but humans have existed for a long time. And research shows that humans in general have the need to survive. And so there's some ability to look at, we've got to care for each other to do that, because we are a community-based species. God designed us that way. And it's also important for the work environment. I think it's sort of a tug of war. You have this reciprocal relationship in a work environment because the environment itself feeds mental health, but mental health feeds the environment. And so it's this symbiote, it's this system that there's a constant tension in how it's affecting each other. Because if the mental health is slipping, then the culture and the environment are slipping, and that kind of feeds that. But same thing, when we create healthy culture and healthy environment, it often helps boost work, and we spend quite a bit of our lives. We spend a third of our day essentially, and that's a minimum. There's a lot of us that, and realistically, especially in American work culture, may work even more than that. We spend a third of our adult life almost at work. And so that's an environment that definitely creates some of the things that may be part of our stressors. Because like we've said before, not all stress is negative either. You could be doing work that you love, but if you've got a huge contract or a huge project, that's still going to create stress, on your system. And that's just in that one area. And, the other thing I was thinking about too was just, it made me think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I was thinking about it from a little bit of a different perspective. We talk about the hierarchy of needs being that people have to kind of have their base needs to be open and really get to the realization of their higher level needs. But it's kind of that way in work culture, like we have base level things that we need, but it allows that productivity and things we can access, because it's really hard to access the fullness of my creativity if my mental health is in the gutter, or it's hard to access my problem solving, which is a higher level thing in the survival space, if I don't have good communication or relational skills. And so I've not ever seen that in a diagram. It may exist out there, but it's just where my mind was this morning, that it's sort of its own kind of hierarchy of needs. And there is a body of research out there, because work is such a part of our lives and our livelihood, there is a huge body of work-related research out there about all kinds of topics, right? But we do know that when we have a more well-balanced life, we are more productive, right? Sometimes if I get the rest, I may get done in 6 hours what normally takes me 10. And so we're going to dive into that a little bit more as we get through this, as we work our way through our script today. But it's definitely important on a human to human level. We are certainly called to it from a spiritual space. The Lord says, I've given you this and I've positioned you that you can give that. If I give you the grace and help bring balance to you, it's really, we're called to love others well, because that's part of the love and the grace from Him. And we're offered to extend that everywhere our foot treads, right? And work is one of those places where our feet tread a lot. So moving on a little bit, before we can properly address how a Christ follower should respond to individuals with apparent mental illness in the workplace, it is necessary to identify the most common mental health challenges faced by employees and coworkers. The Centers of Disease Control identifies 3 major mental illnesses that are common in the workplace: depression, anxiety, substance use disorder. And anxiety may manifest as social anxiety, generalized anxiety, or obsessive compulsive disorder. What are some significant signs and symptoms of mental health challenge at work? I'm thinking such as tardiness or changed interactions with coworkers. So what are some of the things you guys have experienced or you've seen people experience, or even just from your body of knowledge that might show up in the work environment that indicates we have something that might need to be addressed?
Yeah. Change. I think when something goes from one thing to another, like when a person who has consistently been acting one particular way all of a sudden starts acting a different way. I mean, tardiness kind of taps into that a little bit. Changed in interactions. When somebody who's usually low key all of a sudden is giving kind of a $1 reaction to a 10-cent situation, like they're responding completely, and that's not their normal. When think about things in terms of substance use disorder, right? Like the lack of focus, tardiness, missed days at work, changed interactions with people at work. Obviously some physical symptoms, if they smell like certain things or, substances, or if their eyes are too dilated, or they're spacing off, or if they're having angry outbursts. If, you see marks on a coworker, that might indicate self-harm. Or, you're noticing that somebody who used to be pretty chillax is like chewing their nails down to the nub. So like those kind of behavioral changes, if somebody's starting to startle at different things, or even showing up with bruising, there could be situations at home in terms of, or other places in terms of violence happening, and that's going to of course leak into someone's performance. One of the other things related to anxiety would also be something like a acute stress disorder or a post-traumatic stress disorder that it can evidence because something at work triggered them, or something in life has triggered them, and their nervous system hasn't been able to get back down to a state of calm. And of course, they're going to carry that with them into their workplace. So those are kind of the first things that would pop up, kind of immediate, like, oh, so-and-so's acting off. And a lot of times, even if it's not like a thing you can put your finger on, there's just a different energy in the air, a different emotional climate happening around someone, the way they're interacting with the team, that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'd add too, like if you're allowed to take a lunch break away from the place, that the lunch breaks get a little bit longer. Maybe they left one way in one set of mindset, but they come back in another mindset. They did something during lunch, or maybe they're just disappearing from their desk. They're harder to reach. Their work is getting more and more delayed. Trying to think what people would actually notice. Like we would notice, but what would other people, what would you really actually notice? They're talking faster. They're, maybe covering their heads, head down more, covering their faces more. That's how we tend to like express externally those types of things. Or maybe they're talking way slower. It's harder to get an answer from them. We're getting more I don't knows,
right,
or give me time, or just trying to think that through.
Yeah. I was kind of thinking along that line too, Sherry. I was thinking, and it may show up in other places because it depends on who it is. This could be a leader in your organization. It may not just be one of your lower level employees. I look at micromanagement because that's a control thing. If I'm feeling out of control, if somebody has started to micromanage their team or their project or whatnot, I look at things like blaming. Are we blaming for certain things? Are we finding that you may find this person complaining more about other employees, the leadership, the company itself? And some of it could be toxic work culture, because sometimes that can happen. But obviously, if we're building a business, hopefully, ideally, we're trying to avoid toxic work culture. But But if someone is reporting that they're feeling like there's toxic work culture, it's at least worth our exploration to see what's going on inside of the culture of our organization. Because it could be some organizational stuff or it could be this individual, but either way, this thing needs attention, right? This person needs attention. And so I look at things like low motivation, low energy levels, more isolation, withdrawing, may be gone for more frequent appointments, things like that, taking more days off or half days or leaving early. You may find more passive aggressive or aggressive statements coming out. You may just see, oh, I had a thought and it just floated away. It happens sometimes.
Well,
But yeah,
one of the,
go ahead.
sorry.
No.
I was going to say, what's something that's been like kind of in my head this whole conversation is also identifying that things that we normally, traditionally, stereotypically have allowed to be okay in the workplace, such as bullying, and some of that aggression has been normalized in some workplaces. Those are actually mental health issues. And so when we're talking about changes in behavior, perhaps the bullying has increased. And maybe the target is someone else who's having mental health issues because they're not able to speak up for themselves, or they're withdrawn or avoiding or whatever it is. But those dynamics between more than one, the dynamic between the team, within the team, can often indicate that there's things going on that need to be addressed. And by the way, most managers aren't taught how to do any of those things. They're not put through management school.
I was just about to add a couple questions since we're here, and Miss Pamela, she said we could think about any other thoughts we had. And so, when we start to notice that as an owner or a leader, what are some of the things that we should start to do? What do we start thinking about for action in those situations? What are our
I think
thoughts?
it starts with a caring conversation in private, appropriate private, if it's like a cross-gender thing, like at a church, with in a room with windows, but it starts with a conversation. Say, hey, I've noticed there's been kind of a shift here. Are you okay? And historically, as Sherry had talked about before, there was kind of this like work-life split. We're not in that environment anymore. Now, when we're talking about executive coaching, we're talking about executive consulting, it often starts with that conversation of, what's working right now in your life and what's not. The wheel of life that they're using in a lot of executive and life coaching, in terms of like, if your life was in these different spaces, how well is the health in some of them? Because the functioning of your entire life is, of course, you want it to kind of be uniform in terms of health. And so I think it starts with a conversation. And if it's something that you need to bring someone else in, like let's say it's like a male leader and you notice it's a young female worker, maybe there's a female on staff that could be there or also have that conversation, because maybe there is something going on at home. Maybe there's something going on with her children or her partner that is affecting work life. And so it starts, I think, with a caring conversation to see what's going on. And then, of course, to see how the company can support their employees in terms of, there's a lot of employee assistant programs that larger companies have, lesser ones. A lot of churches offer to provide counseling and coaching for their staff and their ministry leaders. But I think when you notice it's hard and it's scary, and a lot of people are afraid to intrude or to go where they're not invited, or they don't want to bother, or they have their own fear that they're going to be shamed, so they don't want someone else to feel shamed. So I think the first step's often a brave conversation and with care.
And I want to tack something onto that with what you're saying about the conversation, because something I do think that it shows up culturally, period, but I think it especially shows up in workplace culture, because we have seen drastic shifts in workplace dynamics in the last 20, 30 years, especially. And you do deal with a lot of cross-generational work ethic expectations. That is happening, you have the whole, we know like companies like Google with the break rooms and the restaurant, like, and trying to build culture that, and people who are working from home more often, and the traditional work standards are shifting in some companies and things like that. But that's important for us to think about when we engage conversation, because you may be a baby boomer talking to a millennial or a Gen Zer, or a Gen Xer, and those generational lines create different cultures about work ethic, about what work standards and traditional work looks like versus what the modern workspace looks like. And we have to be respectful both ways, right? Because you may be an older leader talking to a younger person, because that is going to affect how they're perceiving stress and what their expectations are. And vice versa. If you're a younger generation who has an older person on your team, it helps to step in, like we always say, you want to step into that space and listen to understand. Because if you are approaching it in the understanding, you're creating space to address any of the issues. Because if there are issues around cultural expectations that aren't being met, because really, honestly, traditional expectations have shifted so much, probably never this rapidly in the history of work culture in some ways, except maybe in the Industrial Revolution where you had a total shift, right? Like, so, we are dealing with that inside of work culture, period. Even with AI, like there are things that are shifting expectations and workloads and flows and all those kinds of things, which affect stress levels. It affects how do we even understand some of the relational dynamics, not just with people, but even inside of some of the new technology and cultural things. So I think it's just really, really important to show up with understanding, that I'm going to listen to understand, because there may be an individual need that needs to be met here, or there may be a systemic need that needs to be addressed. And we need to listen with both ears, because when we are talking about this, anytime in employee culture, we want to listen to address the need of the individual and the other relational things involved, but we also want to listen, is there anything systemically that needs to be addressed inside of our organization? Did you have any thoughts about that, Sherry, about things that we should do when something does come to our attention or we're seeing something inside of our workspace?
No, I love this conversation. I've been out of the corporate world for a very long time. I was in the corporate world, and I've owned a business and run a business and had just a few employees myself. So kind of been on both sides, but it's that corporate business thing. It's been a long time, but I was just thinking about being very clear, right? What are clearly what are our expectations? Being very, and having those conversations all along makes this so much easier, right? If we've had conversations all along on here are my expectations, and what do you think of that? What are you able to do in there? Does this sound reasonable to you? Or is there anything that would stop you or make it hard for you to meet I want to give you everything that I can give you to help make that work. And please feel free to bring up to me anything that is in the way, because I don't necessarily see everything. Being able to be very open all along makes this so much simpler when something more, not necessarily crisis, but when you can see the changes that we've been talking about and that something's going on. And as long as that's in place, this makes sense, because people will shut down if you have been kind of more of the, authoritarian. Am I saying that right? The overly authority person. That's not approachable. You've got to be approachable for these things, because otherwise people aren't going to open up and tell you anything.
I think something else that's important, and I think this is where a lot of people have fear about approaching some of this in the workplace, is that there's the fear that I'm going to cross boundaries or cross role lines, particularly in the workplace, even more than ministry. It can happen in ministry when you work for the church, especially, but especially in the workplace, because people, traditionally speaking, most people have often drawn a line between work and our personal lives. And that line is diminishing in some ways, but it does still exist in a lot of ways, right? There is the space that this is my working space and this is my personal life space. And um, when we're thinking about that and we're approaching that, like, because that's also going to affect how we engage, right? You're going to have some people who come in and it's all on the table. And again, this is where some of that generational stuff may come into, because some generations are much more about those spaces crossing and some aren't. Because we do want to be attentive to, there are going to be some people who come in and go, my personal life is a no-go in this environment. Like, we don't go there, right? It's a time. I'm here to work, I'm here to do these things. And so we do want to be really receptive to, that we're exploring that space and that there is some lines, but because the other side of that is we as a boss, as an owner, as a leader, as a manager, we do have a sense of professionalism, because professionalism still does exist inside of workspace culture. And that's where I think people do get afraid, is that place between professional and personal. And how do I walk that line and maintain that boundary? Because you do have power roles that exist inside of the workspace that you're dealing with. And I think that's why some people get afraid. Like, if I step in and I say, okay, you're having a rough day, take that half day, people kind of worry, like, oh my gosh, am I going to disrupt the workplace culture and everybody's going to want this all the time? Or, if I step into this and I have a personal moment with this person, am I going to lose some of my effectiveness as a leader? And one of the things I would say is, it's possible that maybe we need to create space to have that conversation, especially with our leaders. Even inside of our leadership training, how do we approach those lines? And I have never had a whole lot of discussion. We get that as counselor training, where's the line between personal and professional? And, one of the things I like about pastoral is it allows a little more personal connection. And I know that even in the field, there's been some research that some appropriate personal connection does actually help foster some of that rapport. Because we're not there for a counselor to get their need met, right? But it does help build some of the connection, and it meets us human to human. And that's, I think, navigating that as a leader, as an owner, we don't want to be afraid of that line so much so that we become so rigid we can't meet the emotional and mental needs of our people. But we also don't want to be so loose that we lose our professionalism, because we are someone who may have to discipline and create exercise. And we do create a culture, because we have to create health for other people. The reality is, if you are coming in here and being aggressive or, making statements or not getting, that's affecting everybody else. And I as a leader, what I know, I led groups for 10 years, y'all. I led thousands of groups. And if you as a leader don't maintain the safety of a group, your group will fall apart. And so that is important. Any other thoughts about things that we should consider if we start recognizing these things are happening with someone or inside of our company? Just checking before I move on to the next thing.
I would just add that, be willing to ask for help. Like, whether you're the leader or one of the team members or wherever you are on the hierarchy, whether that's inside the organization or outside organization, ask for help. Be willing to ask for help. None of us were not made to do this alone.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask one more question that isn't on the script. So, because it crossed my mind, kind of what I ended saying, the reality is some of us are on the receiving end. If there is someone in our workplace with a substance abuse issue, or someone is going through a difficult time, what are some of the things we might need to be aware of within ourselves as a coworker or as a leader in that situation in the work environment?
I think self-awareness is critical in any role anyone has, whether it's parent, partner, coworker, leader, because when other people experience their stuff, it's gonna bump against what's ever in us, our own experiences, our own memory, our own prejudices, our own biases. And so to be self-aware is so critical, and to notice without judgment, to notice, how am I responding here? what's my first inclination, and to put a pause in, because some of us, if we tend to minimize our own emotions, which a lot of times I think those who go into people helping fields do, it's very either habitual to minimize other people's feelings, or the opposite, we give them too much power. And so I think that it's really important to notice, like, how am I responding to this? In counseling training, we talked about the parallel process, or isomorphism, what it is about their experience that's pulling me into their experience with them. And sometimes through the parallel process, we take on what they're feeling. And then sometimes we also have to tune to what we're experiencing. What is this person trying to draw out of me? And that's probably what they try to draw out of a lot of people. And then we can use that therapeutically. So I think the same is true in any role that we have. This idea of, like, it's going to be tempting to kind of align, because our brainwaves love to do that, right? They love to align with people around us and mirror empathy, all the mirror neurons with our empathy. So I think being aware to go, wait a second, I think this is their stuff, not my stuff. If you tend to be one of the more empaths, if you tend to be one of the people that is really drawn by what people want from you, whether it's because you're highly sensitive or because you're a people pleaser, that's also something to attune to, because go, wait, this is something that they need to get their needs met, but that's not my need. And to be able to have that differentiation starts with self-awareness. Who am I? Who am I in the Lord? What's God's agenda here? How do I love in the name of the Lord? And how do I allow them to have their experience? And how do I then show up for them? So I think that's really critical. I think it's critical to be aware of our trauma, because wherever you work, someone's going to hit it. And it's so critical to have your tribe, your therapist, your life coach, your friends, the other people in management that are vulnerable, where you say, okay, this thing at church is happening right now with this person. Like, if you're on staff at a church, and like, it's really trying to pull this thing out of me, and I know that's not in their best interest or mine, but it really tugs on my trauma. So having our own community of support, um, accountability can be kind of a loaded word, but accountability in its truest sense, which is we can safely give account to somebody else, and they can be our witness, and they can join us in the process of living a healthy life, and a God glorifying one. So yeah, when that comes up, man, that self-awareness and that self-care by having your tribe is so critical to be able to respond with not fight, not flight, not freeze, not blame, not codependent fixing it, but to be able to show up in a good space.
Absolutely. Do you have any thoughts, Sherry?
I think Christine said that beautifully. Like, emotions are information. They're not necessarily factual, they're not, but they are information. Like, look at that, listen to your intuition. We often have that, like, tuned out of us. We're taught from early on, particularly those of us who do have a very strong intuition, don't listen to that, it's nothing, you're wrong. No, listen to your intuition, but again, it's not facts, but it is information. Christine said it beautifully.
Absolutely.
And I also want to speak to the people who tend not to look at emotion, because I think a lot of times people in leadership are cut off from it. And I think that is, do your work like Sherry was saying, it's information. As Jessica always says, emotions have a job to do. To dismiss them and discount them and say, oh, you're just too sensitive. Don't go there. Learn to honor that. God made them. God's an emotional God. You see it throughout scripture. Let's not perpetuate a dishonoring of the human experience. So do your work, because a lot of leaders tend to go a little bit more towards, maybe the less empathic or less empathetic stream of things. So do the work to be able to honor feeling, if that's kind of the way you go, as a leader, so that you can have a healthy environment where people can show up.
Absolutely. I think it's important. Self-awareness is absolutely key, and it is important. I think sometimes we forget that as people, I don't show up as separate professional and personal. I'm all in one body. And that's true for everybody there. But there are going to be situations relationally when these kinds of things come up that could hit your own stuff, your history stuff. But it can also just be wearing. Like if you are the coworker who's had to pick up the slack, if you're the coworker that has been on the receiving end of the aggression, because we know that hurt people, right? And so when someone is hurting, we may be on the receiving end of that in the workplace. And the likelihood of that is high that we'll experience that at some point. And it's why I asked the question, because to lead through that, we have to be able to deal with that in ourselves, right? Like I may have personal anger, but I have a process professionally to deal with it. But I may have to deal with my personal anger or my personal hurt so that I can lead effectively. And so, and I think that's part of where it's really good to have good leadership culture, because you don't want your leaders addressing that down. You want them addressing that upward. If they are having like, hey, I'm really angry. This keeps affecting me. I keep missing timelines with my own kids because this is happening. I got to deal with my anger so that I can deal with this appropriately. Like, and we want to create an environment where we can lean on each other, because the reality is if I'm the direct leader and if I had a dad who was addicted, and I'm dealing with an addiction issue, but you're a leader and you didn't have that. So it's not as personal for you, it's good for us to create a culture of support in the right directions. And just to be aware that we may have personal things that come up, and it's an invitation to explore that for ourselves also. Because that's just real. There are days where, you know what, I'm having a rough day. And if you're having a rough season and today you popped off at me, it could be the right thing, right time, wrong thing, right time, so it's just, I do think it's important just to highlight that it's wisdom to always have that self-awareness like you talked about. And even the invitation to be intentional, I think self-check-ins, like it's okay I might need to check in with myself. If my own irritation level's going up, I need to check in about all the reasons that's true, because it may not just be that your report has been late 3 weeks in a row. There may be something about that that is an issue. So I'm going to get back on script now that I've asked a couple other questions here. So, Pamela says, clearly there are policies and procedural requirements for dealing with some of the behaviors that are present when an individual is challenged with mental illness. Poor performance and not working the required hours of the day must be addressed with discipline. But what of melancholy and isolation from peers and other behaviors that do not directly impact performance? What is the Christ-centered way to intervene as a manager, as a coworker? What are some of the things we might do for intervention?
I think we've addressed already, and I'm feeling like we addressed a lot of that. That is a different one. And again, it's the awareness, be willing to have the vulnerable conversations, reach out. People need to be able to offer resources, let them know that they're supported, they're cared for, they're cared about. Being able to be a friend without getting pulled into the emotion, whatever that person is dealing with, without getting pulled in so much that it becomes overwhelming for the person who's trying to be kind also. Yeah. But those things, those show up too, because a melancholy person, isolating person, they're also impacting the team. Mm-hmm. So something is not operating as effectively as it could. And so that is going to show up and impact other people. So that is a management issue to be kindly, gently addressed. And that person probably needs resources and being being encouraged to seek that outside help.
Yeah. 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 I mean, the thing is that while we work, life is also happening, right? We have all the things that come with life, our illness of ourself or children or parents, aging parents, situations at church or whatever, cars that break down, water heaters that need to be replaced, postpartum depression, so while we are doing our vocation, we still have life happening in our emotional and interpersonal world. And so I think what Sherry said, I really agree with wholly, which is that those vulnerable conversations, because I think especially as women, that whole like waffle versus spaghetti brain thing, that was, but I think especially as women, we often tend to be more networks than we are cubicles. And when you have a sick child and you still go to work, part of your brain's always wondering how that child's doing, right? And as with your heart, and you just don't leave that worry behind. If you have an aging parent, you have a sibling going through a really hard time, we kind of carry that in our hearts with us while we're doing the task of the hands and the other work that we do. Um, so to have cultures that do care for each other, not in a fix each other codependent way, but a nurturing environment. And that does start, like Jessica, you were saying, with management. Does the management honor the fact that mental health days might be necessary? In a Christian environment, I think we have an extra special ability to say, hey, um, you know, can I be praying for you? How can I be praying for you? Is there something that we can rally in our church to support you? Would it help if I gave you, $20 and a coupon to, Papa John's, something that we can offer care for each other beyond just workplace care, in a way that honestly usually doesn't even cost us a whole lot, but does let the other person know they're not alone. I think that there's especially with isolating and melancholy, there's often this kind of desire to be alone, but also this, sense of I am alone. And so to even just show up, and again, it can be frightening because a lot of us don't want to intrude and we don't know what to do and we're scared we're going to say the wrong thing and all of that. But as a manager or coworker, to just step into that space, and say, hey, I noticed it seems like maybe you're withdrawing. Is something wrong with us? Is something I can do to support you? Is there something coming up at work that scares you? Can I sit with you, Mike, while you make that call? Do you want to have, a debrief after, something where we notice each other? I think as we go through this world with social media and people really don't feel seen. It's like the more we're seeing each other through our devices, the less we're seeing each other as people. And so to really do that, Jessica, one thing you always say is it like all comes down to connection, right? And I feel like that is so applicable to this workplace thing too, is that it's just all comes down to connection.
I had the thought when I answered this question for myself is even just I wrote respect boundaries and as we've been talking, I was thinking about that, like, because some of it I already talked about, but honestly, it's one of those things that you don't have to wait till there's a problem. I would say as a coworker, as a leader, as an owner, a manager, and really just as a person, like being a person and being a believer. When we talk about having intention, this is one of those things that I can explore before I have to engage it, right? Like I can spend time with myself and understand my own weak spots and my strength spots for supporting people. I can learn from the experiences I'm having. I can identify what my boundaries and expectations are. I can also be responsible to know what the companies are. If I'm not the developer of it, that I seek to actually understand what some of those policies and procedures are. Because, you know, let's be real, when people get trained and you read, 1,000 pages in a training manual or on a computer, do people read every word and understand every benefit? Real talk, no, they don't. So if I have a working understanding of those benefits, I might be in conversation with someone who doesn't know they can take a day off or doesn't know how to ask for that day off, Um, and and I don't mean that, but like, oh gosh, that happens all the time. It just that even as a leader, I need to be aware of those policies because I may have to evaluate what is the working functionality of that policy when it's in practice. And so having a working understanding, because even if I'm not the leader or the developer of that, if I'm a coworker and an employee who's had invested time and I recognize that a policy is affecting people, there's nothing that stops me from sharing an innovative idea with somebody to say, hey, I have an observation and I just want to put it out there. Here's what I'm tracking with my experience on the floor with my coworkers, because companies that stay functional, it's because they are always evaluating what is the effectiveness of something and when does something need to change. Like I was thinking about that when Sherry was talking about bullying, I need to be aware. What are the policies? I need to be aware of what does that look like? Um, because some people aren't having the big things that may show up in isolation and melancholy. People can easily start withdrawing, especially if they don't know where those lines are. But I I think the big thing is being intentional, having good communication. I wrote here safety and listening to understand. You know, if I am fostering an environment with my communication, if I'm fostering an environment with my policies and procedures, you know, it's okay to step into humanity. If I know my boundary is okay, I might have power here, but that doesn't mean I can't ask, how's your weekend? Or how are your kids? It doesn't mean I have lost all functionality of ability if I have to write you up. Not that that's our end goal, but I don't lose the power to do those things just because I have humanized a person. And so that's what those are my thoughts about that. I have lots of thoughts in my head. They just keep swirling. So forgive me. So final observation, managers should not only make available mental health days for employees, they should insist that they are taken. They should insist on work-life balance. So that being said, we've got about 4 minutes. So I just want to hear from each of you kind of if I had one more thing to share or one more thing that's a passion point for me about this, what would you want to share with our audience today?
I think it's that things will show up in the workplace if they're happening in your life. I think the women and men, as generalities, I think some tend to act in, some tend to act out, some tend to kind of wear it without talking about it, some tend to get more testy with their coworkers, and I think the idea that we can somehow split off our character and our life from our work persona is false. And I think that this generation is more aware of that than ever before. And so that whole person health, that whole person integrity, having connections and community, being self-aware, taking care of, just being a good steward of our body, our mind, our spirit, our soul, our relationships, our finances. In terms of Christ-centered response to individuals whose symptoms become apparent in the workplace, knowing that we're all human, we all get our turn. We all get our turn where things are stressful or painful or hard, or there's a medical something. And so to be able to lead with empathy and self-awareness, and to not allow the fear of offending to get in the way of showing compassion. And if we're a person who tends to not spend a lot of time in the emotional world, to do the work so that if somebody comes with a mental health issue, we can lead with compassion there too, and not with rejection or minimizing. Because we really do glorify God when we are the hands and feet of his love to each other. And a lot of times when we meet somebody or somebody's going through a rough time, the support that we give them can set them up to be able to be just a remarkable contributor to our company and our teams. And we're all allowed our development arc. We're all allowed our turn to hurt. And how wonderful to support each other during those seasons. And, get them to HR if they need to, activate the EAP to get counseling services, talk with management about how can we support each other during this time. Our families are all still trying to figure out life again with post-pandemic, our kids' brains still have not fully restored to what they were before all the shutdowns. Their academics still aren't. Colleges are trying to do catch up. So I think that extra bit of grace for each other, where we can really acknowledge that we're human, and so we can not be afraid, but we can help each other.
Yeah, and remembering that we're talking about like companies come in different sizes. So, smaller companies don't have all the built-in resources that larger companies do, but regardless, so I challenge, if you're a business owner, if you're a Christian in business somewhere, that think about treating mental health with as much focus as we treat physical health. And like if to be a little blunt, if someone says, I can't come in, I'm throwing up, we're going, don't come in, stay home. Well, let's be just as generous and as open and as understand the importance of also vacation days, mental health days. These things are just as important. They're not less important. So even if you're a small business and every person is very vital to the operation of the business, you want that vitality to keep going and growing and get more important, more glowing, more that the best is coming out of people. Then we have to treat and approach that mental health piece with just as much strength and courage and importance as we would anything else about that person that they bring.
Absolutely. And I would say a last thought for me is just, well, I have two things I would say. Can you hear me? Sound went out. I would say first, our ultimate job, as a believer, our ultimate purpose is to love one another. It is to be the hands and the feet of Jesus and stepping in that. And we have compartments in our life, but for the kingdom, there are not compartments. We are called to do that everywhere we go. And it's okay that we have some of that compartmentalizing. That's how humans organize information. But to recognize that that call extends every compartment of our life. And that leads to the second thing of that is be willing to go with the Lord to explore any fear about the truth of that, that we have boundaries and beliefs and expectations about each of those compartments. And what does that mean relationally? Because this may be true even outside of work. It could be another part of your life. Like in that part of my life, I have all these expectations, and it's just worth exploring. Is there anything that hinders loving someone well and meeting someone where they are in any part of my life? Because that is the call of being a believer. And that being intentional about exploring that with the Lord allows you to remove any of the obstacles that gets in the way of loving someone well. And work is one of those places. And again, there is a place for professionalism, and we absolutely need to exercise it to create safety inside of that environment for everyone involved. But one does not have to beget the other. There is space for both things to coexist. So thank you for joining us today. Ladies, it has been such a pleasure to talk with you guys. Just a couple quick things. Next week, we have a guest speaker. I believe it's Miss Julie Watson, Mills Watson, and she's talking about, it says, here's the deal. So we know that Julie works with Juice Plus, and she's all about health. So I'm excited to hear what she has to say. A couple other announcements just to remember. June 8th is Food is Not the Boss of Me. It's a whole day. They've got panels and experts. Beth is going to be talking about her book, Food is Not the Boss of Me. Julie's going to be there, so I'm sure you're going to hear more about it next week. As they talk about it. But we want to invite you guys. That's an in-person engagement where we can come together and really tackle health things. We've got God Golf and Girls August 16th through the 18th. And so I encourage you guys to come. That was a life turning point for me, getting involved and getting connected with some new women in my life, especially in the season of transitions that I've been in. So it's definitely worth it. And you got Take Charge Tuesday, next week at noon on Tuesday, and prayer on Monday at 9. And just to begin to prepare the way, June, Pamela did some praying, and June, we are going to be tackling some tough topics. And so we really want to be able to wrap around our community. We will be talking a lot and exploring what is it to, we're going to jump in the trauma into the pool. We're going to be talking about different types of abuse and things, and what does that look like, and support we can get, and different things like that. And so just to prepare your hearts and your minds, if you're an active part of this community with us and doing that, obviously we're going to explore that with safety. But I just letting you know what's coming next month, that we want to be able to wrap around people to support that. So we hope you guys have a blessed rest of your week, and we look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks, or next week with Julie and Beth. Bye, y'all.